Our lease car went back in October last year, so I thought this time round I'd embrace the electrical revolution and lease an EV instead. But little did I know that just about every barrier that could have possibly existed to installing one of these chargers did in my situation. So I thought it'd be useful today to pass on to you everything I've learned during this process. Everything I've had to go through, both financial and DIY related, to make this happen, and I'll also be advising you on all the mistakes I made, the things that didn't occur to me, and the extra costs I've had to incur, so that hopefully it'll arm you with all the information you need to decide whether you're ready to take the plunge. To keep this video completely impartial, I've paid for everything you see in today's video, including this charging point behind, and the company Charged EV who installed it didn't pay me anything to mention them. But you might see this video has been marked as containing paid product placement. This is because today I've taken the very rare step of bringing in a sponsor, Drayton Smart Heating. Something I've only done a few times since starting this channel, and I only do this where I've got experience of the sponsored product being brilliant, and most importantly where it's got nothing to do with the video. What can I say about the Drayton system? Well, check out my vid from a year ago for a complete rundown, but suffice to say it's been bulletproof since installation. Smart thermostats can be added to each radiator so you can set different room temperatures, and heating schedules for each room in the house, which they reckon can shave a good £200 off your annual heating bills, or a saving of 39% over a traditional timer and room thermostat system. You've got geofencing, which switches off the heating automatically when the last person leaves the house, and an Eco Smart mode, which adapts your heating depending on the weather, switching off sooner whilst maintaining the temperature. The app tells me energy savings each month, but bottom line, I genuinely love this system. And a lot of you out there seem to too, judging by the comments below my video. I'll put a link in the description below this video to where you can find out more. Well, I've got quite a lot to get through today, which I'll run through as quickly as possible. You can see on screen now the areas that I'll be talking about. There are two ways you can charge your EV. Firstly, through a typical 3-pin plug socket, which gives you a power of about 2.3 kilowatts. And secondly, a lot faster by means of one of these bespoke charging ports. Typically at 7 kilowatts, although if you're lucky and you've got a 3-phase supply, 22 kilowatts. So a friend of mine has one of those Golf ID3s, and he was charging it through his kitchen window. So I thought I could go one step better and plug it into an old 3-pin plug socket here in the garage. But unfortunately, it's just not that simple. Firstly, with a 3-pin plug charging at 2.3 kilowatts, charging a 78 kilowatt hour battery like ours from empty is going to take at least 34 hours. Fine if you don't make a lot of long journeys, but it's a disaster if you make long journeys one day after another. I say at least because there are other factors to consider, like the fact that the 3-pin plug socket in here is linked to our house by a 1970s power cable, stretching about 30 meters from the house, with a cross-section area, if I'm being generous, I reckon of about 1.5 millimeters square, an early version of this mineral insulated copper-clad cable. And if you try and send a flow of electricity down a cable like that, you get what's called voltage drop, even slow charging from a 3-pin plug. Now, voltage drops down the length of a cable because of the resistance in that cable. And where you've got an old cable like mine over this long stretch, that resistance is going to be considerable. And you can see the voltage dropping here where I up the current in the car from 6 amps to 32. Although for a 3-pin socket, the current's going to be limited to 13 amps, and the car has actually shackled it to 10. But that 208 volt reading in the car is wrong, and we've been chatting about this on our Discord group, and we think it's probably because the car calculates voltage from current and power rather than actually measuring it like you would with a multimeter. You can see from this table the difference between the actual voltage during charge and what the car's reporting it as. But the point here is that, as you can see, the true voltage drop from the old 1970s cable is a worrying 8% when charging at 10 amps. But shackling this down to 6 amps brings a voltage drop down to a much more acceptable 4%. Now, with any luck, most of you won't be needing to charge your car so far away from the house. But hopefully this little example illustrates that you can't just plug your car charger into any old 3-pin socket around the house without doing at least a bit of detective work just to make sure your wiring's up to it. Because a large voltage drop can overheat your wires, or at the very worst, actually melt them. To decrease the voltage drop, you have to increase the cross-section area of that cable, which lowers the overall resistance of the cable length. But as cable is expensive, as you'll see shortly, you need to find a cable that fulfills your requirements without over-speccing it, which will waste you money. In my case, an almond cable with 10mm square cores is adequate even for my 7 kilowatt charger over that 65 meter run, which is what I've got now, back to the consumer unit in the house. And thanks go to Thomas and Dalton on my Discord chat forum for helping me calculate that. Although there are online calculators available which can give you a bit of a heads up on your situation. Which brings us neatly onto the second point in this video. Now, the majority of EV installers are using this EV Ultra cable at the moment with 6mm square cores, which is generally more than adequate for the shorter cable runs that they've got between the charger and the consumer unit. EV Ultra cable has either 4 pairs of Ethernet cable incorporated into the actual cable itself, or as in this case, just 1 pair. Now, the reason for needing the Ethernet cable is you need at least 1 pair of Ethernet wires if your charger, like mine, has active load management, or as the Indra charger calls it, load curtailment. And what it's doing is it's monitoring the power being used to make sure your charger doesn't overload your power supply. And what's happening here is you've got a communication directly from the charger back to the meter box where a CT clamp attaches round one of the tails, as you can see here. Just something to be aware of, if you're thinking about installing solar panels, you'll also want to utilize another pair of wires in that Ethernet cable, because the inverter will also want communications back to the meter box, again with another CT clamp. And finally, depending on what charger you decide to put in, more on that in a minute, you'll want to connect to the charger via the app on your phone. And for that, the charger typically communicates with your home Wi-Fi network or via a fixed Ethernet connection, or in the case of this one, via a 4G dongle. It can actually do both. Now in my case, I obviously needed 10mm square cores in my cable, and EV Ultra I don't think generally comes in this thickness, albeit you can probably put in a special order for this. So I decided to install 2 SWA armoured Ethernet cables in the same trench as my electrical cable. And here is all 130 meters of it ready for install. One going direct to the meter box, and a second connecting back to the router in my house, which I've used to install Wi-Fi in the garage, useful for security cameras, and if we ever decide to convert the garage. So let's run through the other issues I encountered on this project. Next, we've got the main cutout fuse upgrade. The DNO, as they're often called, which stands for Distribution Network Operator, had to upgrade the cutout fuse in my meter box from the 60 amp fuse that was there to this 100 amp fuse. Why is that important? Well, it's all about the additional load your car charger puts on the system. If you imagine that your 7 kilowatt car charger puts a 30 to 32 amp load on your system, and you've only got, as I had, a 60 amp fuse, you can see you've already used up half of your capacity in the system. And so you only have to have somebody running a power shower, hot tub or an oven, and you could potentially blow this main cutout fuse. Now you'll find that the suitability or otherwise of your fuse all gets flushed out during the onboarding process when you sign up with an EV charger installer, like the one I used, Charged EV. During which they'll ask you a series of questions like your MPAN number, which you can get from your electricity bill. They'll want photos of your existing consumer unit and your meter box. And what they'll probably do is contact your DNO to ask them to upgrade the fuse if that's what needs to be done. That cutout fuse upgrade by the DNO is, by the way, done free of charge. Now, if the DNO upgrade your main cutout fuse, they'll probably also ensure that the tails going from the cutout fuse to the meter are also upgraded to 25mm. I don't think they've actually changed mine, so they must have been adequate. So the next thing we've got to talk about is upgrading the fused main switch and the tails running into it and out of it. Firstly, the fused main switch is only 60 amps and needs upgrading to 100. And secondly, I've got 16mm tails here that need upgrading to 25mm square, both from the meter to the fused main switch, but also from that switch to the consumer unit. Now, I don't have a clue where those have been channeled by my predecessors back in the 1970s, but I suspect they're channeled somewhere through this wall in the downstairs toilet, which is no longer allowed. So I've got a couple of problems here. Point one, where the tails leave the switch fuse and head into the consumer unit, I've got to somehow find a way of channeling a new set of 25mm tails from an upgraded switch fuse. I think we're going to install something like this through trunking, which is compliant with electrical regs, back to the consumer unit in the house. But the other problem we've got is this. These tails here from the switch fuse into the meter box are, strictly speaking, the property of the utility company. Now, they'd probably be quite happy for me to supply new tails, and after all, I have some left over. But in an ideal world, the utility company need to attend on site to connect these tails into their meter. And guess who my utility company is? Bulb, who've gone bust. And whilst your utility provider's on site, you also want your DNO there to take out the main cutout fuse to knock off the electrics so that your utility provider can upgrade the tails between the meter box and your new 100 amp fuse main switch. And I guess your electrician to upgrade these tails from the fuse main switch back to the consumer unit to 25mm squared. Luckily though, because my charger's got load curtailment on it and therefore shouldn't overload the system, I've been able to install that 7 kilowatt car charger that we'll come on to in a minute, whilst for the time being leaving these 16mm tails and of course the old fused main switch in position until I've had them upgraded, which I'm going to do shortly. Now, moving on to number 5, loop services. Not something that's relevant for me, thankfully, everything else seems to be. But I thought I'd mention it because loop services happen where you share your supply with a neighbour, and the clue again will be in the meter box if you've got more than 2 supplier cables coming into the service head or main cutout fuse. The problem with sharing your main supply with a neighbour is it limits the power that you can take and determines whether this main cutout fuse can be upgraded or not. Whether you've got looped tails is another question that the EV installer will ask as part of the onboarding process. Because to have a 7 kilowatt or higher EV charger, you've got to have your own mains grid access. And again, this is something the DNO will sort out, and I don't think you get charged for this. But your neighbour won't be very happy if you've got to dig up their drive to do it. The next point the EV installing company are going to want to know about is that all the earth bonding has been correctly done to the gas and water. My supply comes via overhead pylon, so for earthing I'm reliant on an earth stake down in the basement, with all the water pipes earthed when the stake was installed. But how does the EV installer connect his new 7 kilowatt charge point to your home electrics? Well, I decided to take a new feed from the garage directly to my home consumer unit. But some charger installers have in the past, and maybe still are, connecting to your electrics directly in the meter box. I'm guessing they do this via an additional consumer unit in the meter box, but there's an interesting video by eFix which explains why you shouldn't do that. I'll link to it in the description below this video. The reason for this is that the DNO actually owns the space inside your meter box, so they might not take kindly if you reduce that space by installing a new mini consumer unit, because their point is they might need that additional space in the future as electrical components get upgraded. So the following assumes you're going to connect your charger like I have to the main consumer unit in your home. So you've got to check if you've got a spare way or space in your consumer unit for a non-RCD way. And if you haven't, then you need to ask yourself if you've got space for a new consumer unit, or indeed you could upgrade your existing one. And I had, as you can see here, 2 consumer units with 2 RCDs in each. Now, there wasn't much wrong with these 2 consumer units installed when I bought the house in 2010, except I didn't have many spare ways left on the second board. And actually none that weren't on RCD circuits. So as I was going to get my electrician in anyway to connect the armoured cable to a new consumer unit in the garage and the one in the house, I thought I'd upgrade this second consumer unit to a new metal one in line with electrical regs. This time with RCBOs in place of the RCDs that were in the old board. Why would I do this? Well, RCBOs are superior to RCDs in the sense that they trip individually, whereas in the case of the RCD it takes out all 5 MCBs, miniature circuit breakers, that are attached to it. And by having that RCD inbuilt into the RCBO, you're actually freeing up extra ways on your circuit board. Because you can see here each RCD actually takes up 2 ways on the board. So what I've ended up with now is a 40 amp RCBO in the house fuse board to feed the garage. Also with this inbuilt surge protection. And then we've got a new consumer unit up in the garage with the main switch and individual RCBOs to feed the garage supplies. And of course the 40 amp RCBO to feed the new car charger. And as my house has an earth stake, I decided to save a bit of money and, dare I say it, the convenience of having a slightly less bulky cable by going for 2 rather than 3 core armoured cable, and instead install a new earth spike up at the garage. Now, choosing the location of my charge point was nice and simple. There wasn't really anywhere else I could put it. Proximity to your car is the obvious thing, but you've also got to think carefully about minimising the cable run from the charge point back to your consumer unit in the house. Let's have a quick look at charge speed. This 7 kilowatt charger will now charge my 78 kilowatt battery from pretty much empty to full charge in just under 11 hours. Which quite honestly has been a game changer. We're no longer reliant on fast chargers when we're doing a long journey on consecutive days. We were having to journey into town where there are still far too few quick chargers. Check what capacity your car's onboard charger has. It may be limited to 3.5 kilowatts. but you might still decide to put one of these 7 kilowatt chargers in just in case in the future you change your vehicle to one that allows for 7 kilowatt charging. You've also got to think about what charger to go for. Chargers come in a variety of shapes and sizes, both dumb and smart. But the key things to consider are, do you want it to be tethered, like this one which comes with an inbuilt cable, or untethered? We decided to go tethered to remove that hassle factor of having to reach for your cable either in the car or in the garage every time you charge it up. Do you want a charger that has solar integration? Some chargers like this Indra have solar integration, which allows you to charge your car entirely on excess electricity generated by your solar panels. Now, some chargers allow scheduling to access cheaper nighttime tariffs. I've actually just switched from Bulb to Octopus, which has a tariff enabling you to access 4 hours of cheap charging overnight at 7.5 pence per kilowatt hour. Obviously not long enough for a full charge, but it helps. Although I should point out that Bulb also have an EV tariff which you can switch to over the phone if you have a compliant smart meter. Some chargers also monitor electricity usage and cost. Now, a few people have said to me, I'm going to wait until I get an EV because the car dealer will probably sort out the car charger. Be wary of this, because a lot of car dealers have entered into preferred partnership with charger installers or charge point operators, and these deals may not be the best and the chargers themselves might not be the best for your requirements. And don't forget, if you have a 3-phase supply, you can of course benefit from a 22 kilowatt charger. Now, the next section was the most arduous part of the project for me, and hopefully something that most of you out there won't have to worry about. Plotting a 65-meter route from the garage back down to the new consumer unit in the house. The new cable would have to head diagonally across the garden, go under a brick garden wall, which I ended up having to demolish because the concrete foundations were too thick to drill through. The dear old guy who owned the house before me, I think, was even more OCD than I am. And after all that, I had to drill a series of holes in my 1/2 meter thick flint and clay cellar walls to get the cables into the house. Something that even with my beast of a Titan SDS drill, I really struggled to do. Now, the plan was to dig a 450mm deep trench for the 10mm armoured cable. And after digging about 2 meters, I realised I wouldn't be able to dig the whole thing by hand, and managed to borrow a 3.5 ton digger from a friend up the road. Here's me on day one learning how to use it. Fortunate as it turns out, because none of my local hire shops had any available diggers. Now, you'll often want to surround the cable with gravel to protect the cable from stones as the earth settles around it. But I didn't bother here because there were very few stones in the trench, and actually for about 30 or 40 meters of it, as you can see here, I had a thick band of almost pristine sand about 400mm down from the surface. And the other measure you need to take is to lay warning tape above the electrical cable. The main 50-meter section of the trench was simple enough with a digger, but a 15-meter section would have to be dug by hand, as I couldn't get a digger into the bottom half of the garden. But as the digging progressed and I realised the extent of the carnage I was creating, I turned my mind to future-proofing. We may at some stage try and get planning to turn our garage into a living space for our son who has special needs, so I decided now was a good time to get water up to the garage from the house. This meant increasing the depth of the trench along its entire run to 750mm. To lay a 25mm diameter MDPE water pipe at the bottom of the trench. I also decided to lay an additional 25mm square armoured electrical cable in the trench, partly because it occurred to me that with the possible addition of solar panels, and if we were to convert the garage to living space, the 10mm SWA wouldn't be sufficient. Clearly, if I'd thought about this earlier, I wouldn't have had to spend 230 quid on the 65 metres of the 10mm SWA, because the 25mm would have been more than adequate for both the EV charger and for any future requirements in the garage. And finally, we had the steel wire armoured Cat5e data cables, which I positioned at the other side of the trench a bit higher up than the electrical cables to minimise any interference those cables might create with the data. I made this measuring stick with the key 450 and 750 positions marked on it, but I have to say, digging that 15-metre stretch to 750mm deep was absolutely exhausting, and I could only tackle about 3 meters a day. It's also very exhausting and time-consuming gradually filling the trench to the various depths for each cable run and positioning the warning tapes. And as I edit this video, I still haven't filled in the final 15-metre stretch. The plan was to get all the cabling in place to minimise, for me, the cost of the electrician attending on site to connect up the 2 consumer units. The 25mm SWA cable has a huge radius on it, so drilling the cable through the wall at an angle, channeling the radius, into the wall helped keep it close to the wall when fixed in place, which I tried to do with these Linion clips, a fabulous product that doesn't require wall plugs, but the block work was too soft to hold the 25mm SWA in place, so I resorted to more typical cable cleats for this. So who can install an EV charge point? Well, you can pick up the chargers themselves at electrical retailers like CEF and lots of others besides. However, I'm going to stick my neck out here and say you've got to get this done by a specialist installer. When you're dealing with this much power, it has to be earthed and bonded correctly to comply with electrical regs and to avoid breaching the product warranty, which is why I went for an established installer in Charged EV. Also, I was fortunate to get mine installed before the 1st of March, which meant I qualified for the £350 government grant, which again Charged EV took care of, but which has now sadly ceased. Electricians who have done the course to become an OZEV approved installer can obviously also install, but my electrician hadn't done the course, isn't in any rush to do so, which is why I was happy to use him in tandem with the EV installer to get the job done. So you're probably wondering what sort of costs I had to incur to get all this installed. Well, the cost for me at least was considerable, and I say for me because with any luck, if you're installing your charge point on the side of your house, you won't have anything like the cabling that I needed to have done. And a lot of installers include 15 meters of that EV Ultra cable as part of the installation cost. Running through the figures, and I've excluded that 25mm SWA because it wasn't relevant to this install, it's for future proofing of this garage. The hardware came to £412.43. My electrician charged £1,375 for supplying and installing the new RCBO consumer units and earth spike up at the garage. And the cost of the charger, including install, was £774. Although, as I just mentioned, it would be likely to be over £1,000 now that the OZEV grant is no longer available. So a combined total of £2,561 for me. A high price when you haven't factored in the cost of the electric car itself, which luckily we've leased through our old business, which my wife's now running. So is it really worth incurring all this cost? Well, arguably not on the face of it. But you should see this, I think, not just in terms of the baseline figures, but as an infrastructural asset that you're adding to the house and which will add to the value of your house. As consumers, we're stuck between a rock and a hard place at the moment with rocketing costs at the fuel pumps. It's now 176 pence per litre down the road, but also rocketing electricity prices, particularly when the price cap comes off in April. The estimated £140 that the Indra Charger app estimates as the cost of charging the car in February when we did a lot of miles is less than we would have spent refueling our old lease car. Although with our electricity currently at 19.6 pence, and it's going to rise a lot from that in April, the saving from charging a car rather than fueling up at the pumps isn't as much as we would have liked. So having gone this far, the next step I think would be to install solar panels. Now I've got the infrastructure in place for them. With the car and much of our home energy needs supplied by solar, and an estimated payback of 4 to 5 years rather than the 10 years that it would have been before the energy price spike, solar is starting to make serious sense and would also provide further justification for the costs that you've spent in installing that EV charger. So that's it for today. I really hope you found that useful. If you have, you might just click on the like button below. And don't forget, everything I've referred to today, any useful references, will be in the description below this video, which you can access on your smartphone by clicking on the little arrow and on your PC by clicking on the Show More button. It's been a big old video this, which is why I haven't been doing many videos recently. I'm going to be returning to a more normal schedule from now on with a video per week, so do keep an eye out for those. And you can help with that, particularly if you're a new subscriber, by subscribing to my channel, which would really mean a lot to me. It helps to support what I'm doing. You can do that by clicking on the link here, and don't forget to click the bell notification icon so you get notified of all my future uploads. See you soon.